Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Well, I'm excited to be here today. Thank you so much for being here. See a lot of Jayhawk gear, so I know I'm in friendly confines here. But so Stories of the Phog is a passion project of mine. Worked on it for a couple of years. It's just released in October, so it's still relatively new. But yeah, excited to share some stories from the Phog with you today.
There we go.
So first, I thought I'd tell you just a little bit about myself. I'm a Kansas native. I was born in the small town of Floyd, Kansas, which isn't too far from here, town about 3,000 people. And then grew up in Lawrence. Went to elementary school and middle school in Lawrence, and then moved with my family to Ottawa, Kansas for high school. So graduated from Ottawa High School. And then ended up going back to Lawrence to go to KU, graduated with a degree in journalism. And my first book was called Beautiful States of Mind, and it was about traveling all 50 states with my two daughters. I currently live in Overland Park with my wife, Isabel, who's also my publicist there. My daughter, Kyle, and then my oldest daughter, Nia, attends KU, so it's been fun getting back to KU a lot more often lately. And when I'm not writing, I work at Johnson County Community College in workforce development. And the picture's a little bit grainy, but that's me and Kushler at basketball camp way back in 1986. And my first game, so people ask me how I fell in love with KU basketball. And my first game was in 1982. I was a fourth grader. And I begged my mom to take me to a game, so she took me and my sister. And things were a lot different back then. KU wasn't nearly as good. In fact, they finished with a losing record, which is kind of hard to imagine now. We didn't have to get tickets in advance. We just showed up and got tickets at the gate. They're about the same price as a movie ticket, actually. And Missouri was really good. They're a top 10 team. They had John Sunvold, Steve Stepanovich, Norm Stewart was a coach. And KU lost. It was a really close game. They lost 41-40. Low scoring game. They didn't have shot clock or 3-point line back then. But even though KU lost, I fell in love with the program, everything about it, Allen Fieldhouse, the players who seemed larger than life to me, the pep band, smell of popcorn, the electric atmosphere. So even though they lost, I became a lifelong fan. And in that picture is David Magley, who was a really good player in the late 70s and early 80s. And a few months after my first game, through a friend of my mom's, she was a low range for me to meet David Magley, and we went to a video arcade in Lawrence. We played games like Pac-Man and Galaga and talked basketball. And for me, it's such a big deal because David Magley had no idea who I was, and he agreed to meet with me. And I was a fan because of the basketball, on the court performances. But after that, I got to know a player, and he took interest in me, and I became even a bigger fan. And David Magley is one of the people I interviewed for this book, and I hadn't had any contact with him for over 40 years. And I asked if he remembered that kid and going to the arcade, and he said, "Absolutely. You're so excited to be there. I could never forget that." And he's actually the president of the basketball league, which is kind of a developmental league. He's based in Indianapolis, but really, really nice guy. And in this book, there's a pretty large cast of characters. So I mentioned David Magley, Devontae Graham, who's pictured here, as well as several other players I interviewed. And I was able to interview all 4 living coaches, so Ted Owens, Larry Brown, Roy Williams, and Bill Self. As much some of you might know, there's only been 8 coaches in KU's history in 125 years, which is pretty amazing. And several broadcasters, Brian Haney, the voice of the Jayhawks, actually wrote a foreword for my book. And as expected, just a couple paragraphs or so, but he did a heartfelt introduction. And he grew up in Topeka, and his dad used to take him to games when he was a kid, and he kind of reminisced about that and how I planted the seed for him to be a broadcaster. And then Kevin Harlan, some of you are probably familiar with him. He does NFL games, NBA games, a lot of different sports. But he graduated from KU, and a few years after graduation, he was really young, like 24, 25 years old. He was the voice of the Jayhawks for about 5 years. And then after that, he went to Missouri and broadcast Missouri games. So he provides some great insights about the rivalry and there's a big game tomorrow with KU and Missouri. So
Yeah.
the rivalry is still strong, even though we're still not in the same conference. And then I interviewed a couple of athletic directors, Drew Jennings, who hired Bill Self. And it's kind of funny because he was the CEO of Kansas City Power and Light, big company in Kansas City. And he says he was just an interim athletic director for KU. He was only there for like a month or so. But he says more people remember him for hiring Bill Self than his entire career as a CEO. And then I also interviewed Travis Goff, the current athletic director. And the landscape of college athletics has changed so much with NIL and transfer portal. So as you can imagine, he has his hands full, but doing a great job. Then a couple of film directors that directed films about KU or players or featured Allen Fieldhouse. Some of you might remember The Day After as a made-for-TV movie that aired in 1983. And that was filmed in Lawrence, and there's a scene in Allen Fieldhouse that includes some information about that. And then some people that you might not expect in a book about KU basketball. So some members of the band who make the experience so unique and help create that environment. And then I was able to interview Devontae Graham's mother. She was only 14 years old when she had Devontae Graham. They're still extremely close. And when Devontae was there, most players still stayed 3 or 4 years. That's changed a little bit, but it was cool to see in her eyes, her son developed through the program over 4 years and how he grew and, how the coaching staff made him into a man, both on the court and off the court. And then I was able to interview the great granddaughter of James Naismith and Phog Allen's grandson. So, they're huge names in Lawrence, Kansas, but not just for KU, but college basketball in general, the inventor of the game. And then Phog Allen was known as the father of college basketball coaching, so he really took coaching to a different level. And then some super fans, including one of the fans that created the Beware of the Phog banner, which I'll talk a little bit more in this presentation. But the lead role in this book is Allen Fieldhouse, and it's the one thing that stays consistent through the entire book. And it opened on March 1st, 1955. The first game was against Kansas State. KU won the game. And it's the all-time attendance record at Allen Fieldhouse. There's over 17,000 people in attendance, standing room only. There's been some renovations over the years. So right now the capacity is 15,300. So that record will never be beat. He hardly ever loses at home. They just lost at home recently to UConn, but it's very rare. They win about 90% of their games at home. And it's the loudest college basketball arena in the country. In 2017, it set the record against West Virginia at over 130 decibels. And to put that in perspective, that's like a jet airplane taking off right next to you. So prolonged exposure could actually cause some hearing damage. And Jake Billis, the commentator who attended Duke, calls Allen Fieldhouse the St. Andrews of college basketball. And it's commonly referred to as the cathedral of college basketball as well. And that picture is me and my 2 daughters a few years ago in front of the Phog Allen statue. And I was fortunate, I was able to interview one of the original architects of Allen Fieldhouse. His name was Warren Corman. And unfortunately, he just passed away a couple of months ago at the age of 98. But a great guy, super sharp. He actually got to know Phog Allen really well. Phog Allen was a driving force behind Allen Fieldhouse. He pushed for it for decades, but first there was the Great Depression and then World War II, so it took a while. But finally, the Kansas legislators approved funding for Allen Fieldhouse. I think it's about $2.5 million. And Phog Allen was extremely hands-on. So every Friday afternoon or Saturday morning, he'd visit the state capitol in Topeka, where the architects were working on plans for the field house. And he checked to make sure that the capacity would be at least 17,000 people because he wanted it to be larger than Bramlage, which was down the road in Manhattan. So he was on there being at least 17,000 people. And as a junior architect, Warren Corman was only 24 at the time, so it was an assignment for the ages. But as a junior architect, he was responsible for designing the windows. And if you've ever been at Allen Fieldhouse for a weekend game when it's daytime and the sun's streaming through the windows, it really is kind of a mystic experience. And he was the person we can thank for that. just out of curiosity, how many people here have been to Allen Fieldhouse? Okay, so almost everyone, yeah. Um, and then I'd asked him about the air conditioning, because I'd done a summer basketball camps there when I was young. And in August is stifling. And even if you go to a game early in the season, like October, November, it gets really warm. You have to shed your layers of clothing. But he said that each fan puts off about 3,000 BTUs per hour when they're excited at a game. Does anybody know what BTU is by any chance? I didn't know before he told me. But it stands for British Thermal Unit, and it's a unit um, of energy that measures heat. And so he said if each person puts out 3,000 BTUs and there's roughly 16,000 people, it would cost $8 to $10 million to provide air conditioning in Allen Fieldhouse. So he said not to expect that anytime soon. It would just be very expensive. Um, and then he brought this up. Almost everybody's been to Allen Fieldhouse. So if you've been recently, you notice that the lines for the men take longer than the lines for the women, which is pretty rare for a sports arena. And he said there were some renovations in Allen Fieldhouse in the 1990s when Bob Frederick was athletic director, and Warren Corman helped with the renovations. And at the time, females were complaining because the wait for the restroom was so long. So Warren Corman took it upon himself to go to Kemper Arena in Kansas City, where they used to have the Big 8 tournament. And he stood outside the women's restroom with a stopwatch, and he measured, he calculated the time that it took each person to go in and out of the restroom. And certainly he received some puzzled looks. We found that women on average take 4 times as long as men to use the facilities. So when they did the renovations, they put 3 times as many stalls in for the women as the men. So now if you go, the men have to wait longer than the women.
No wonder he didn't get arrested.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Yeah, she got reported, certainly. And there's been some great teams in KU's history. These are generally regarded as the greatest teams of all time. And I'll do kind of a unscientific poll, but I'll say that the year of the team, if you can raise your hand if as either your favorite team or you think is the best team of all time, if you can just vote once, and there's about, you can kind of keep track of the numbers. So 1952, 1986, okay, 1988, no, 1988, okay, a couple, 1997, 2008, 2020, okay, and 2022. Okay, so pretty equal. And it's funny because since I've been doing this, no one said 1952. I think it's just because it's so long ago. But I don't think you could go wrong with any of these teams. They're all great teams. But I'm actually going to talk about the teams that did not win a championship. So I thought gentlemen back there said 1986 was the best team of all time. Now, that's my favorite team of all time. I grew up in Lawrence. I was in 8th grade when they were making the run of the Final Four, and they were so fun to watch. Danny Mann was a sophomore on that team. They had Craig Ryan was a center, Calvin Thompson and Ron Kellogg, and then Cedric Hunter was a point guard. And off the bench was Chris Piper and Archie Marshall and Mark Turgeon. And they lost to Duke in the Final Four. And that year, that's really the championship game to beat KU in the Final Four and then beat Louisville beat Duke in the championship. But KU had already beaten Louisville twice that year, actually. So probably KU was the best team that year. They just, they weren't able to win it. And then the 1997 team, it's generally considered one of the greatest teams in KU history, but not just in KU history, but in collegiate basketball history. The only game they lost the entire regular season was to Missouri in overtime. And then they lost to Arizona in the Sweet 16. And it's a really good Arizona team. Arizona would win the championship that year, and they had 4 NBA players. But KU's starting lineup, there's 4 first-round draft picks, and all 4 of those players played at least 10 years in the NBA. So you had Paul Pierce was on that team, Scott Pollard, Rafe LaFrance, and am I missing Paul Pierce, Scott Pollard? John Fano. He's likely to be the next head coach at KU. And then the 5th starter was Jared Haas, who's a really good player who became a college coach. So even though that team didn't win the championship, it's still considered one of the greatest teams just because they're so dominant that year. And then 2020, I know people like to forget about the pandemic, but KU was number one almost the entire season. They would have been the number one overall seed in the tournament. And unfortunately, they didn't get a chance to play in the tournament. But my interview Bill Self, I asked him about some of the great teams of all time. And I asked him if he thought the 2020 team would be remembered, as one of the great teams in KU history. And he said, unfortunately not, just because if there's not a banner in Allen Fieldhouse for a team, which is a minimum of a Final Four, but if there's not a banner for a Final Four championship, then people tend to forget those teams. And there have been some great teams in KU history. I think it's the 1966 team with JoJo White, the 1957 team with Wilt Chamberlain, the 2010 team that lost to Northern Iowa. There's been some great teams, but when they don't win a championship, they tend to be forgotten. And Coach Self said in 10 or 15 years, unfortunately, that team will probably be forgotten just because they didn't have a chance to win a banner. So I thought that's kind of interesting. And then 2022, a year they didn't win a championship. That was actually my favorite moment as a KU fan. I was able to go to the Final Four and watch them beat Villanova and then North Carolina in that epic comeback. And I was able to take my oldest daughter, who's a fan as well, who's not KU. And it was a bucket list item for me. I've always wanted to watch KU win a championship in person. And it's something you can't plan because you can go to the Final Four, you don't know if they're going to win or not. But to watch it in person with my daughter was a special moment. So still my favorite KU memory of all time. And then these are some of the greatest games at Allen Fieldhouse since I've been a fan. And certainly there's been some great games between 1955 and 1988. But I was kind of go briefly over some of these games. So the first game, 1988 versus Duke, this is actually the only game on this list where KU lost. And the reason I put it on there is that was the first game where the Phog banner made an appearance. And I was a sophomore in high school that year. I remember seeing the banner for the first time and wondering where in the world did this come from. And I was able to interview Michael Jenneman for the book. He's an architecture major. And him and one of his buddies were sitting in an architecture class, and they came up with this idea of the phrase. And then they enlisted a group of friends to help them. And in typical college fashion, they had some drinks, and one of the friends lived in a dorm, and he stole 9 shower curtains from the dorm. And then late at night, they strung the shower curtains together, spray painted the message on there, and then they hung it up for the Duke game. But a lot of fans are superstitious, so KU lost to Duke, and they didn't know if they were ever going to use it again. They brought it back to their dorm. It's just kind of sitting in the closet. And then they decided to bring it back for the senior night that year. It was one of the more memorable senior nights in KU history. Archie Marshall had been injured earlier in the year and hadn't played most of the year. But Larry Brown put him in with about 30 seconds left or so, and he was still hobbling. But Oklahoma State didn't guard him. They let him shoot the ball. And he took about a 30-foot shot, wasn't even close to making it. It was an air ball, but the crowd went wild. And KU won that game. And Phog Allen's granddaughter requested that the banner be hung there permanently. So now, it's part of Jayhawk lore. Every game, the announcers will say, "Beware the Phog," or "Welcome to the Phog." It's on T-shirts and mugs. And interestingly, I asked them if they trademarked that or copyrighted it. And the group of students did not, so they don't get any royalties for that at all. But, they're still proud of their contribution to KU basketball. The 1989 game versus Kentucky, KU won that game 150-95. Yeah, still the highest scoring game points for a KU team in history. It's also the worst loss for Kentucky ever. Rick Pitino was the coach that year. And
They wouldn't stop pressing.
That's part in the book. I talked to Roy Williams about that. Yeah, Rick Pitino was intent on pressing the entire game, and they just come off, or they were on probation actually. I think they only had 8 scholarship players. So Roy Williams at one point called a timeout and asked Rick Pitino if his players needed a break, and it kind of turned into a little bit of a controversy because Pitino thought he ran up the score a little bit, but when the other keeps pressing you just attack the baskets. So. That's one of the more memorable games. The 1993 game versus Indiana, that's when Chuck Vaughn hit a 3-pointer at the end of the game to win the game, and Bobby Knight was the coach for Indiana. 1998 versus K-State. that's the 100th year of Kansas basketball. And they brought Will Chamberlain back to retire his jersey. And it was a really emotional halftime ceremony. Will Chamberlain hadn't been back to the Fieldhouse since his playing days, since 1957. And he always felt like he let the fans down because he didn't win a championship. And so it's kind of a full closure moment because he got a huge ovation. He actually stayed after the game for hours to sign all the autographs. He was actually wearing his leather jacket from his playing days. So it's kind of nice to find peace back in Lawrence. And he passed away a year or two after that. And then in 2003 versus Texas, that's when Nick Collison scored 24 points and had 23 rebounds. And Dick Vitale gave him a standing ovation when he fouled out at the end of the game. And Dick Vitale's been broadcasting for over 40 years. He's seen Michael Jordan and countless other great players. He's only done that twice, once for Nick Collison and once for David Robinson, who played at Navy. And I was able to interview Dick Vitale for this book as well. He has vocal cord cancer, says an email interview, but he talked about how special that moment was. And then 2012 versus Missouri, that's the last game they played Missouri before they departed for the SEC. And it was a huge rivalry game, but it meant even more because first is the last game before Missouri went to a different conference, but also that year decided the conference championship. And KU was down 19 points in the second half with 16 minutes left even, and they made a furious comeback, ended up winning the game in overtime. And that picture is Thomas Robinson blocking a shot at the very end of the game and forced the game in overtime. And I asked Coach Self if he thought that was a foul. And he said the block was clean, but then it came down on the body, so it probably should have been called a foul. But fortunately for KU fans, they didn't call a foul, and KU won that game. And it's still talked about today. And that was one of the loudest home field houses has ever been in that game. The 2016 game versus Oklahoma, KU was ranked number 1. Oklahoma was number 2. There's a big Monday game on ESPN. And KU won in triple overtime. And it's still remembered as one of the greatest games by an opposing player. Buddy Hield for Oklahoma scored 46 points in the losing effort. And then the 2017 game versus West Virginia, which I mentioned earlier, it set the record for the loudest game ever. And in addition to that, KU was losing by 13 points with just 3 minutes left, and they came back and forced the game into overtime, and KU ended up winning. And when I interviewed some of the players, people associated with the program, like for instance, Devontae Graham said that Allen Fieldhouse creates around 5 wins per year for KU. And you think about it, there's so many close games where it could go either way, and the crowd just wills the team to win almost. Brian Haney and Kevin Harlan said that most home court advantages are like 4 to 5 points. On Fieldhouse is 8 to 10. So it does make fans make a huge difference at on Fieldhouse.
I have a question here.
Yeah, you bet.
So the KU Kentucky game where KU scored 150, that was a revenge game because the year before Kentucky beat KU by about that.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, that's true. And feel free to ask questions or comments. Yeah, go ahead.
I remember a game at player's name was Bannon. And they had I'm sorry, that's junior high. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. No worries. But yeah, feel free if you have comments or questions, jump in, and then I'll Q&A at the end too. Oh, did somebody? Okay. And then the image on the right there is the original rules of basketball, and James Naismith created those in 1891 when he was a PE teacher in Springfield, Massachusetts. And I interviewed Josh Swade. He's a super fan. He grew up in the Kansas City area, went to basketball camps. And he lives in New York now. He's a filmmaker. And he actually did a documentary for ESPN's 30 for 30 called There's No Place Like Home. And if you haven't had a chance to watch it, I highly recommend it. It's about how the rules came back or made its way to Lawrence, Kansas. And I interviewed Josh about how he made this help bring the rules back to Lawrence. And he lived in New York, and he found out the auction of the rules was at Sotheby's, and it is only about 10 blocks from where he lived. And so he got this idea that the rules should be in Lawrence because that's where James Naismith is buried. And he reached out he connected with Dr. Mark Allen, who's Phog Allen's grandson. And Dr. Mark Allen really wanted the rules to be in Lawrence, but he didn't have the financial wherewithal to bid on them. And so he connected Josh with David Booth, who is a prominent booster for KU. He's recently in the news because he gave $300 million to the KU athletic department. And David Booth grew up in Lawrence. In fact, he lived just a few blocks from Allen Fieldhouse on Naismith Drive. So he's a lifelong KU fan. And he decided he wanted to make a bid on the auction. And he didn't think it was going to go as high as it did. But it ended up going, he bid on it for $4.3 million. And I interviewed David Booth. And for the auction, there's two people who are finalists, and neither of them were there in person. It was done by phone. And he didn't know it at the time, but the other person who was bidding was a Duke alumni. So if David Booth had not won, the rules would be at Cameron Indoor Stadium right now. So if you go down to the house, there's a Booth Hall of Fame right next to it, and the rules are under a glass case. And I took they're more protected than the Louvre actually. It's they're pretty well protected. And so if you haven't been there though before a game, check it out. It's pretty cool. I think the takeaways for this book are three things: the tradition, the passion, and the hope. And when you combine those two things, what you get is Jayhawk Nation and the pride that comes along with that. And in terms of tradition, so there's been other teams that have won more championships, but I think it's hard to argue that KU doesn't have the strongest tradition overall in terms of its consistency and the great coaches and players that have been associated with the program. And I mentioned there's only been eight coaches in KU history. 5 of them are in the Hall of Fame, which is incredible. The first coach was James Naismith, who invented the game of basketball, and he's still the only losing coach that KU's ever had. And then after that is Phog Allen, who made a number of innovations to the game. He helped make basketball an Olympic sport. And in addition to the 5 Hall of Fame coaches, there's been multiple players who played at KU who have gone on to Hall of Fame coaching careers, including Dean Smith, who was on the 1952 championship team, coached at North Carolina for decades. Adolph Rupp in Kentucky played at KU. Ralph Miller coached at Oregon State. And then another name that not as many people are familiar with is John McClendon. He was an African-American student who attended KU in the 1930s. So due to segregation, he wasn't able to be associated with the program, but James Naismith took him under his wing, and John McClendon would go on to become a Hall of Fame coach and made a number of innovations to the game. Typically, people credit Dean Smith with the four corners offense, but it's actually John McClendon who invented that. And he also invented the modern day fast break. In fact, I interviewed Kevin Wilmot, who's a film director in Lawrence, who won an Academy Award, made a movie. It's called Fast Break about John McClendon. And Larry Brown got to know him very well. People kind of forget, but Larry Brown was a great player at North Carolina, and he was on the 1964 Olympic team. And John McClendon was assistant coach, so they got to know each other really, really, really well. And it's one of the reasons Larry Brown ended up coming to KU. You know, there's definitely ties between North Carolina and KU, but he said John McClendon, he looked up to John McClendon so much. And throughout his coaching career, he always used something from John McClendon's playbook in every practice. So it's a name that a lot of people aren't familiar with, but he made a number of contributions to the game. And then in addition to the coaches, the players, people like Will Chamberlain and Clyde Lavella, Danny Manning, Paul Pierce, and the list goes on and on. And then just the passion. It doesn't matter if it's a non-conference game early in the season or if it's a rivalry game. The place, Allen Fieldhouse is always packed. It's loud. It's an electric environment. I've been to probably 10 other arenas and nothing that comes close to Allen Fieldhouse from what I've seen. Generally, I think the closest comparisons, Cameron Indoor Stadium, and I took a tour there. I wasn't able to watch a game, but those are generally regarded as the two loudest environments. But Allen Fieldhouse is about twice as big as Cameron Indoor, so just more volume, I think. And then hope. KU's the only program where every year there's a chance to win a championship for the last 40 years. There's no other team that can say that. And since I've been alive, we won 3 championships. So almost every year it ends in heartache, but every year you think you can win, or the next year there's a chance. And I'd say with the exception of the last 2 years, which are kind of down years by KU standards, we almost always finish in the top 10. We're always a number 1 or 2 seed almost every year. So we always have a chance to win the championship, which is very rare. And then you combine those things and you have what's known as Jayhawk Nation. And I'm going to read a brief excerpt about that from my perspective. It can be hard to describe the pull of Kansas basketball to those not in the know. Basketball is an important part of the equation, but it's more than just basketball. It's about family and friendships, traditions and superstitions. It's about wearing your lucky sweatshirt and watching a game over the holidays with your aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents. It's about making the pilgrimage to Allen Fieldhouse in a bitter cold when you should be studying or answering a bothersome email, and then gathering at the Wheel or Johnny's after the game to talk about how you should be studying or answering a bothersome email. It's a shared agony that accompanies the end of nearly every single year, 4 years since 1923 excluded, and it's a shared hope that arises once the next season starts again. All of these components coalesce to form what's known as Jayhawk Nation. And a lot of this book is about basketball, but it's also about relationships and connections. And there are multiple generations of people that attend games. And Kevin Harlan said it really eloquently. I'll just paraphrase, but people have been going to the same arena, cheering the same mascot, for decades and decades. And grandparents take their kids, and then their kids take their kids. And there's nothing like it, really. Brian Haney said it too, the voice of the Jayhawks. He said when KU alumni get back together, they don't talk about their syllabus from their last class. They talk about how KU's going to do in the tournament. So basketball really joins all KU alumni. And there's a lot of fans that didn't go to KU that are huge KU fans. So there's definitely a huge Jayhawk Nation out there. And I travel a lot. And whenever I wear something with Jayhawk on it, even if I'm overseas, people say rock chalk. It's pretty amazing. And then just recently I found out that Stories from the Phog was named runner-up for Sports Book of the Year by the American Writing Awards. So that's a nice honor. And I'm going to actually have Isabel. These are some testimonials from people that read the book, but Isabel's going to say a few words.
I just wanted to share that with you guys can see before filling out the book, and I'm not going to read every single one of them. But she not have received text and email, somebody, some people have made phone calls, and he's gonna tell a story about an 91-year-old person. But the one that I like the most is about Marnie. She read the book wearing her dad's shirt. So to me, that was very special. That's when dad was a big fan. So those are some of the testimonials of you guys.
Yeah, it's cool because over the last month or so, I've been going to a lot of book sign events and appearances. And every time there's multiple people that share their stories of KU basketball with me and their memories. And this book brings back a lot of memories. But I've learned a lot about their memories as well. And in fact, I've accumulated materials I'm starting to write materials for a new book just because everybody has these great stories. And there's as Isabel alluded to, there's a 91-year-old gentleman in California that took some time to track me down. And he's just really excited to talk about the book, and I had a phone call with him. And Phog Allen actually hired his dad as an assistant football coach because Phog Allen was an athletic director at KU too. And his uncle was in James Naismith's physical education class. So it's pretty cool to hear those stories from people that, have been lifelong KU fans and have some of the same memories that I do. With that, I'd love to open it to any questions that you might have. Yeah.
I was at Wilt Chamberlain's homecoming.
Yeah.
I suppose you were too.
I was, yeah.
Did you speak to the man?
I did not get a chance to.
Well, I did.
Okay.
My daughter and, Roy Williams came to us. We were sitting right close to him anyway, just some things that happened totally unexpected that we were right there, right beside him. But Roy Williams came through. I mean, he was there for, I don't know, an hour and a half or 2 hours signing after the game.
Yeah. It takes 4 hours.
And Roy Williams had a box of Kentucky Fried Chicken, then he asked my daughter to take a drumstick out of it, or something like that. And I have a picture of it, but anyway, we were the last ones to leave, and he went out in a white limo, and he was the only one, this is Will Chamberlain, sitting in the back and waving to us, and I was glad you talked about that. That was a happy day for everybody.
Yeah.
Everybody. He had come home, he felt it, we knew it. It was just great.
Yeah, and that's a great story. I hear all these good trouble stories, and you're right. Will Chamberlain did stay till the very last person. He signed the very last thing. Yeah, so that was a cool moment. Yeah,
In terms of attendance, this wasn't a basketball game, but when Bobby Kennedy was campaigning, and he came to campus. And I got there late, so everybody's rushing to get in the Allen Fieldhouse, and up came his entourage, and he was in the back of an open window limo, and he was reaching out and touching flesh with the crowd. And so I got to touch his flesh. And there were 20,000 people, probably more, because they couldn't count it. They didn't have the basketball court there, they had chairs. And so if you put all the chairs in there and then have standing room everywhere, including in the area outside the arena, the walkways around, probably it would accommodate, 25,000.
Yeah.
If there's a tornado coming, maybe.
yeah. And there have been a number of notable appearances. They used to have concerts there too. And but I can't remember exactly who the bands were, but I think the Beach Boys were there, and some other ones, and then some notable speakers as well. And Allen Fieldhouse, there used to be, you went to KU when you were younger, there used to be a track around the concourse, and Jim Ryan actually set a record there, the famous track star. And back then, KU didn't have nearly the facilities that they do now. So when it's cold outside, sometimes the baseball team would practice at Allen Fieldhouse, or the football team would be practicing there. So it is a multi-purpose arena for a while now. It's dedicated to basketball. Yeah. I was just going to mention, because you mentioned Roy Williams, and I answered this, but as other interview Roy Williams, and it's kind of funny because I've reached out to the North Carolina athletic department, and so I went to interview with Roy Williams, and I wasn't really expecting him to get back to me, but he actually called me. I didn't know he was going to call me, but he just called me one morning, and I was getting my kids ready for school, actually. So I had to say, Coach Williams, I got to get my kids to school. Can I call you back? And he said, no problem. I'm retired. All I do is play golf, so you can call me anytime. But he spoke so fondly of his time at KU. And there's a little bit of bitterness when he left, not on Roy Williams' part, but from the fans, because a couple of years earlier, he said he was never going to leave KU, and then he did leave. But, he gave 15 great years to KU. And I think fans, kind of forgive him, especially when we won a championship in 2008. and Roy Williams. Actually, he was in the game with the sticker.
Wow.
Yeah, and you're right. We're still bitterness until 2008, because he won a couple of championships in North Carolina. But he spoke so fondly of KU and the fans and his time there. Incredible, gracious guy. But everybody I spoke to, and I interviewed approximately 35 people, players, coaches, athletic directors, and they'd ask me how long is the interview going to be, and I'd usually say like 10 or 15 minutes, because I knew they're busy people, and I wanted to be able to get their interview. And almost every time the interviews lasted at least 30 minutes, because they start talking about KU basketball, and they get so excited, and they just start sharing stories. So it was a fun to talk to people about their love for the program. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the history of this town, women's basketball?
Not very much. Sam has told me a little bit about that, or more.
I wish you had time to go a couple blocks from your Anderson bookstore. This was a state championship winning team, school. Your Allen Fieldhouse was our Lindley Hall here.
Okay.
Lots of state championships. Very proud here. So you're in a good town with good basketball.
Basketball position, yeah.
Did Len or when Ingram knew?
Yes.
Yeah, he played on the 52.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's nice to tomorrow I'll be speaking in McPherson and at the community building center, and the global refiners used to practice there, and we're on part of the 1936 Olympic team. So I've never been there. I'm looking forward to that as well. Yeah, but
My
yeah,
favorite Roy Williams anecdote is after a humiliating loss, I can't remember the game. The sportscaster's interviewing me, he says, we could not throw the ball into the ocean. And that became a tradition after that. When they were there in the ocean, all the team got out there and threw balls.
yeah, I do kind of, yeah, when there were tournaments and stuff. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, and Roy Williams used to. I was being called from Roy Williams as a coach, but you'd see him jogging around town with his coaching staff, and he had a tradition where he'd go to James Naismith's grave before games and touch the gravestones. So all these coaches, paid respects to their predecessors, which is pretty cool. Yeah.
Our son is not a KU graduate.
Okay.
He, however, was involved with many of the athletes at the Boys and the Girls Clubs where he worked. And he was also a para in the Florence schools. So he had created all kinds of relationships as at the Boys and Girls Club. And many of the basketball players would come there just because they could.
Yeah.
And that enabled him to become involved with Danny Manning and a number of the other people that are playing. And to this day, he and Danny Manning are close friends. And of course, Danny lives in Boulder now, and our son lives in North Denver. So they see each other a couple times a year.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it's really cool. And you mentioned Danny Manning. He coaches, he's assistant for Ted Boyle now. And when I was growing up, I said 1986 was my favorite team. They had a lot of great players, but Larry Brown was only at KU for 5 years. And he built a coaching tree for the ages. When you think about it, most people know that Bill Self and John Calipari were graduate assistants. But I grew up in Lawrence. I used to hang out at the Fieldhouse some and shoot baskets with the team and stuff. And there was a guy showed up one year. He took a sabbatical from his normal job, which was at Pomona Pitzer in California. I was wondering why is this guy here? What's he doing studying Larry Brown? And basically, he was getting his thesis in basketball. He was just studying from the greatest mind, one of the greatest minds in basketball. And it turned out this guy, his name was Greg Popovich, who went on to become the head coach of San Antonio Spurs. So he knew what he was doing. And he created a dynasty at San Antonio. And then there's another assistant coach for Larry Brown, R.C. Buford, and he became the general manager of that dynasty for the Spurs. And then he had two assistants that went on to become NBA coaches, Alvin Gentry and Bob Hill. And then two of his players became general managers for the NBA at the NBA level, Mel Newton and Kevin Pritchard. And then there's a bunch of players or coaches just in that 5 year span that became head college basketball coaches. So Danny Manning, Ted Boyle, Mark Turgeon, a couple others too. But it's just amazing the collection of great basketball minds for that over that course of 5 years.
We got one more question.
Yeah.
Where'd the acronym Phog come from?
Yeah, it's so Phog Allen used to have a really loud voice, is what I heard. So it sounded like a foghorn. And that's basically where it came from. And there's really good, I'm trying to promote my book, but there's another great book too. It's called Phog. I think that's what it's called. And it has a lot of stories like about his start and contributions to the game, but really interesting book as well. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a little off the bottom. Darren Peterson, it sounds like he's gonna play tomorrow. Do you have any updates on any of that?
Yeah, I'm hoping he will. I was hoping he played. Yeah, that's what everybody's holding their breath for. I was hoping he was going to play again in the UConn game, which would make a huge difference, I think. But I do understand that, with hamstrings, they can lead to more serious injuries, so they want to make sure he's 100%. But it does sound like he's probably going to play tomorrow. And I think in the long run, it's going to be good for the team that they've had to learn how to play without him a little bit. They definitely need some more offense. But
I felt the Tennessee game this year actually was a turning point from the last 2 years. That's like they formed when they put their arms around self. That was different. And it's like, man, it made you feel good about being a KU fan. And like, wow, this is a team that's going to be fun to watch going into March.
Yeah, and that's what everybody I've talked to says. This is a team that they're enjoying watching. The last couple of years, it's been a little bit hard to watch, but got that chemistry. They play hard. There's a high ceiling. This team's going to get better throughout the year, where these last couple of years, they actually got worse during the year. So, yeah, it was nice to see that as an excitement. I don't know if you saw Bill Self in the locker room, but he was really excited as well.
I have a question with that. with the name, image and likeness era and the changes to the transfer portal, you know, it made me think about, you're talking about how KU has been so consistently, like most years they have a chance to win the championship. I wonder if there has been concern, or maybe there's still concern when all these changes were coming in, if the factors that made that possible for KU, maybe they won't be there the same way anymore, or like, you know, how does KU maintain its status as like a blue chip program with all these changes happening?
Yeah, that's a good question, because the college landscape has changed so much over the last couple of years. I think KU's in pretty good condition, or in pretty good shape, just because their tradition is so strong. They have a Hall of Fame coach. They got pretty good resources too, especially with that gift from David Booth. And, you know, that Allen Fieldhouse is a huge selling point, certainly, but the game has changed. And I can't imagine being a coach right now with the transfer portal, because it is hard to every year you're rebuilding. In fact, I'm a diehard KU fan, and when I watched the first game of the year, I didn't know who most of the players were. It's every year it's a brand new team, and it's hard to. A lot of fans, they want to get to know the players over 4 years. You used to be able to get to know the players over 4 years, watch them develop, and now it's always a whole new cast of characters. Some of them seem like they're playing for a paycheck sometimes, so it is different. But I do think KU is pretty well situated just because of their incredible tradition, and people are going to play for the best and the best coaches in a blue chip program. And, every year there's almost without exception, players that get drafted in the NBA and big well.
All right, well, let's give Chelan another round of applause.